In this video, I want to introduce the system.io namespace. So this namespace contains a bunch of types that are going to allow us to do things like create, edit, save, delete files in C#. So this is going to level up our software significantly. It's going to allow us to create applications that have a memory to them that are able to persist information. So you might store the player's score so that you can create a board of their high scores, or maybe you need to store the player's progress so when they boot up the app again, it takes them back to wherever they were when they closed it. This is also going to introduce a lot of configurability to our applications. So if we wanted to make a data visualization that drew some like ASCII bar graphs based on some data that we give it, if we hook it up so that it can read from a text file, then to get it to visualize one piece of data versus another is just swapping out that text file. We don't have to make any changes in the code. We are going to build something that looks like this. It's going to be a little journaling app that allows us to read a file, clear the file, and add things to a file. So right now, if I read it, the journal contents are empty, but I can add something to it. And then if I read it again, there's my journal entry. And the key here is that if I go ahead and quit this application and start it up again at a later time and check out the journal, that information is persistent. It has stayed there because we are reading this from the hard drive. So this journal is synced to the hard drive. We write text to the hard drive so that we can read it in when this application boots up. So we're going to build something where we can keep adding more text to our journal, and then progressively build up the entries. And at some point, if we want to, we can go ahead and nuke the journal, clear everything away so that we have a blank slate. So that's what we're going to be building together, and it's going to require us to dig into the system.io namespace. So IO here stands for input-output, and this namespace contains a bunch of types that allow us to do reading and writing to files and data streams, in addition to working with directories. So there are a lot of classes in here. We're primarily going to be using the file class down here, which gives us static methods for creating, copying, deleting, moving, and opening single files. But it's worth noting that there are classes in here like for working with directories, or the path class here is for performing operations on directory paths in a way that's cross-platform. So we're going to dive into the file class, but just be aware that there are a bunch of classes in here that may be helpful as you start to dig deeper into input-output. If we check out the file class documentation here, importantly, it's telling us that it gives us a bunch of static methods. So we know that it is going to give us methods, reusable blocks of code, and that they're going to be static, meaning that we're going to access them from the class. We're not going to instantiate the file class. We're going to say file.exists to use the exists method inside of the file class. And if we check out an example here, it's telling us this is an example that allows you to check whether a file exists, and then either create that file and write to it, or open the existing file and read it. So we can see a couple of examples of things that are used from the file class. Like here, file.exists is a static method that's being invoked here, and you pass in a string to say, hey, is there something at c:/temp/mytest.txt. There's also this file.createText here and file.openText here. We're going to kind of dig into these examples, and there'll be some structures that you won't have seen before, like a using statement. And there are a bunch of different ways to use the methods that are inside of this class and different ways to create text files. We're not going to particularly be diving into the using statement in this video, but you will see that in some of these examples. Okay, so if we continue scrolling down and click on the methods section, we can see all of the static methods that are available to us. So maybe we should go check out that first one that we saw, the exists method. So here it is. The exists method, we get a little description, determines whether the specified file exists. If we click on it, we can see that same description up here. We can see that it's static, that it gives us back a Boolean, a true-false value. The name of the method is exists, and it takes one optional parameter. That's what this question mark means. And that parameter is a path to check. So it's going to give us back true down here if we have the right permissions to access this path, and if that path contains an existing file. And if those conditions aren't met, we'll get back false. So this is going to be a really useful method for us. We're going to bring it into our project. When our application boots up, we want to create a text file where we can store the journal. So we will check if there's one that exists already. And if there isn't one that exists, we'll create a new one. Otherwise, we'll just load that existing file. So we'll definitely be using this one. Let's look at another example. So say we were thinking we wanted to put some text into a file. You would then scan through here to look for something that sounds like it is adding text to a file. Maybe I would hit Control F to search here and search for something that has the word write in it. And I can see the hits over here over my scroll bar. So if I scroll through, open write, maybe write all bytes. Oh, that's looking more promising. Write all lines, write all text. So we've got a bunch of things down here that are involved in writing to a file. And one thing you will see immediately is that there are overloads for a lot of these. So there's a write all text that takes 2 strings, and there's a write all text that takes a string, and an encoding. There's a write all lines that takes a string and an enumerable here. There's a string enumerable encoding, string array, string array encoding. So as you're looking through the documentation here, trying to find the right method to use, you want to look for the right signature. So you may have to click around a few times to find the right overload. So for what we're going to do, maybe we just want to dump a string into a text file. If we click on this, we can see the extended description, creates a new file, writes the text to a file, then closes that file. And this is importantly going to override that file if it exists. So it's static, it doesn't return anything, it takes in a path and then an optional parameter here of the contents to put at that path. We can see a bunch of exceptions that it might throw, like if we tried to create a path that was too long for the operating system. Operating systems will have limits on the maximum length of a path. You might get that error. So because we can see that there are exceptions that could be thrown, it would be good to do this inside of a try catch. And if we scroll down, we'll get a little example of how to use this. So here we have an example that checks if a file exists, and if it doesn't exist, then it goes ahead and writes this string to that path, c:temp my test.txt. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is flip back to the methods section here. Or actually, let's go back to the file and we'll go to this method section. We're going to keep this handy and we're going to come back to it anytime we try and do something in the journal app, and we will parse the documentation just in time for when we need it. So I have a .NET Core console application created here. And what I want to do to just set this up is create a new class called Journal. And into this class, I want to create a couple of placeholder methods that we will then fill in shortly. So let's create a method here for running the journal. So this will be the thing that we kick off our application with. So this should do basically everything. Display the intro, present menu of options, etc. But we're not going to put all of that logic in here. This is just kind of our entry point to start the application. We're going to offload all of this specific, all of these specific tasks to other methods. So we'll need a method to create the journal file. And we'll need a method to display an intro message. And we'll need a method here to display an outro message. And let's create a method here to display the journal contents. So that's when we read the journal and print it out to the screen. We'll call this method. And let's create a method here for clearing the journal file. And create a method here for adding an entry to our journal file. So just creating placeholders, which will help us visualize the structure, and it's going to help us make sure that we don't have methods that are just monolithic, full of lines of code that do different things. We're going to try and split everything up into separate methods where it makes sense. And we're importantly going to make just the run method public. So this is what we will invoke from program to kick off our application running. And all of these are private internal methods that we will use just to structure the journal logic. So actually, let me reframe this. Let's say this kicks off the journal app running. So let's get something displaying to the screen so that we can test our application, make sure that, say, our intro works before we move on to the next feature. So in our program, we need to make sure that we actually create an instance of that journal class. So we create a journal. And then we will call that run method to kick off all of our logic for the journal. Right now, this won't do anything if I try and run it because there's nothing in our run method here. So my console window is going to pop up real quick and then disappear. So if we just print something out and then wait for a key to be pressed, and I'm going to bring in the console class up here. Oops, system.console. There we go. We have something printing out. So we could, instead of doing it inside of run where we print out the journal app read key, let's move this logic into our display intro method and make sure that we call that from here. Okay, that's working. Let's put a placeholder here in the outro method. And let's call the display outro method up here in run. So eventually, like the rest of the logic needs to run in between the display intro and outro. But we should have something that displays an intro title screen and then displays an outro title screen or an outro message. Journal app, press a key. Thanks for using the journal. Application's done. So we've got the basic structure here, and we can fill out the display intro. So let's start with setting up the color scheme here. So let's make the foreground color black and the background color white. and then we'll clear to make sure that that background color gets applied to everything. So if I change that, our color scheme flipped, good. Then I want to add some art here. So I want to add some title art, put a placeholder. And then below that, we can say something like, welcome to the only journaling app you'll ever need. Make sure that works. All right. And I do want to also change the title of my console bar, but I'm going to do that up here. Instead of inside of the display intro, because this isn't really logic related to displaying the introduction method, because it's not displaying anything. This is changing an aspect of our console class. So journal app title. So let's grab some title art. I am going to use asciiart.eu, which has this section for books, and I kind of like this ASCII art. So I'm going to grab that and bring it back into the application. And I'm going to set this up as a field up here. Whoops. Private string title art. And I'm going to use a verbatim string. So drop in an @ and then paste in my multiple lines of ASCII art. And now I should be able to use this field elsewhere. So I can put it in here. And because it's a field, I'll be able to display it elsewhere in the application too. There we go. Looks good. Let's get this outro message set up. So I want to make sure that because I'm using someone else's art, that I am crediting that art from, and I'm going to paste in, whoops, not the art. I want this URL because I don't see anyone's name here. I'm just going to credit it as this URL. Thanks for using the journal. And we want to say something like press any key to exit or press any key. And we want to do the same thing here, like after our intro. So this is a place where it would make sense for us to create another method that we can reuse in both of these places. So I'm going to create a method that doesn't return anything, and let's call it wait for key. And we can set the foreground color to be console color dot dark gray, and right line, press any key, and do our read key here. And now we can use this method inside of our outro for when we want to pause to let the user read the outro before the application closes. And we can also use that here after the intro is displayed. And because I'm changing the color, I'm just going to make sure, we've talked previously about like caching the current foreground color and then restoring it at the end of our function. That's one way to do things. The other way to do things is to just make sure that at the start of each of our functions that display something, we make sure to set the color. So I'm going to make sure that I set the color to black here so that when our intro finishes and the color is set to dark gray by wait for any key, that our outro still shows in black. Okay, so let's see that in action. Welcome, press any key, and our credits. All right, so we've got our scaffold of our application here. We've got our run method, intro, outro, and we can start filling in the rest of this. Like we definitely need to make sure that we have a journal file before we can actually display it, clear it, or add things to it. So I think that's the next place that we should focus in. And this journal file, we need to make sure that when we hit the play button and our application starts up, that we actually have a journal file somewhere on the user's computer that we can access. So if it doesn't exist, we need to create it. And if it exists, then we're fine. We don't have to do anything. So, whoops, did not mean to jump down here. Stay at create journal file, and let's say that this method should check if file exists, and if not, create it. So this is going to use some code that we saw in the docs already. If I flip back, we saw in our example here that file.exists allows us to check whether there's something that exists at the given path. And then there are a couple different ways that we can create text, like this create text method here. And if I fly down to the methods section, I can see, where is it? We've got a create text method here, and we also have a create method here. So let's check out the create text, because this description sounds like what we want. Creates or opens a file for UTF-8 encoded text. And let's also open up the exist documentation so that we have both of those for reference. So the exists we saw before, you give it a path and it tells you true or false, whether that file exists. And then our create text here gives us back something called a stream writer and takes in a path. And it says the stream writer writes to the specified file, and that's where this using information, this using structure comes in, where you're able to get access to the stream writer and then put some content in there, some initial content into your file after you create it. We're actually not going to need the stream writer, and we're not going to need the using. We can just say create text if we want a empty text file to be created without putting anything into it. So let's take both of those back in here. To start, let's just write line, does file exist? And to use the file class, it lives in the system.io namespace. So I could say system.io.file.exists to check if my journal.txt exists here. Or if I head up to the top and I add a using statement in here, so using system.io, that'll let me say file.exists. So I think since we're going to do a lot of file operations, let's bring in system.io. With that in place, we can see that this is now grayed out because Visual Studio is telling us we don't need that full prefix. Okay, so this, if we run it here, let's put it before our intro. Oh, you know what? That's a bad place to put it because our intro clears the screen. Let's do this after our intro so that we can actually see it print out. Does file exist? False. So with this method, if we look back at the docs, I believe it mentions it here. Yeah, so down here it tells us that that path parameter can be a relative path or an absolute path. So absolute path would be something like this, where we start at the root of the hard drive and the partition here that we're trying to access all the way down to the file. The other way that you can do that is with relative path information. So that's going to be based on the current working directory. in our situation, that relative information means that if we look at our journal application in File Explorer and head into the bin where our build is being generated, if we say myjournal.txt, it's going to look next to this executable here for that file. So if I were to create a new file manually called myjournal.txt and run this, that file does exist now. So this is relative to our exe. And if I delete this again, it'll return to false. So we can say if file.exists and put in myjournal.txt. Oh, you know what? Actually, we should say if not file exists, or if this equals false, that's when we want to create a new file. So I'm going to comment out our code here, and this we will use the file.create text that we saw. So here we will create a file called myjournal.txt. And again, this is relative in the same way that exists is relative. So these two are referring to the same location. They're referring to this spot next to our executable. So if I hit play now, there's no myjournal.txt, but after we run the intro, we can see myjournal.txt pops up here. So we can now be sure that after we run this at the beginning of our application, there's always going to be a file called myjournal.txt. So if we tried to add something to it or clear that file, our commands will work. And because we're going to need to refer to this file in multiple places, like we're already referring to it twice here, it's a good idea to break this out into a field. So let's call this our journal file. And we will reference that here and here. And let's just make sure that it's still working. So I should be able to hit play, and it's not going to show up until after we leave this intro here. Now myjournal.txt shows up. So now that we're guaranteed to have that file, it would be good to try displaying that file. So we can always head to where the file is located and go ahead and open this up and add some text in here. And save it. So if we were to try reading from that file somewhere in our application, we should hopefully see that message. If we don't see it, then something's gone wrong. So for reading a text file, we can head back to our file class and look through the methods. And you want to think about what might this method be called. And if you can't think of what it might be called, then you just sort of do a full search through here for anything that's like display or read, or any other synonyms that you can think of. I ran out at 2. So if I'm scrolling through here, I'm not seeing anything until I get to the R's, and I can see read all bytes, read all lines, read all text, and a couple flavors of read all text here, and some more down here. So if we're thinking about what we're trying to do in this application, we're trying to just read everything that's in that text file and display it. So read all text sounds like it might be what we want. Opens a file, reads all the text, and then closes the file. If we, in the future, needed to read it line by line, then this one might be a good fit. that says it opens a text file, reads all the lines, and closes the file. So this sounds like it might give us an array, whereas this one's going to give us a string. So I'm going to pop this open in a new tab. We can see this is static like all the other methods. It gives us back a string, and we pass in a path. And again, there's some exceptions here. In this version of our application, I'm not going to worry about handling all of those, but that would be good to do in the future. So let's try this out. In the scope of our application here, the display journal contents is the function that I want to work in. And just to get things running, maybe we try doing the read all text and dumping it out here. So let's get the journal text using file read all text, and we'll pass in that journal file path that we created. And then let's just try printing that out to the screen. So to get this method running, we have to make sure that we invoke it. So I'm going to fly back up to the run method. After we display our intro and create the file, we can display the journal contents. Aha! Prints out. The text is the wrong color here, so we're going to have to do some formatting. But whatever we put in that file here, should show up in our application when we run it. There we go. So let's work on the formatting of our display journal contents. I want to change the foreground color here. Let's go with dark magenta, and the title that we can print out here, let's do, let's actually use a new line and a couple equal signs. And then after the end of the journal, let's also kind of demarcate that with a bunch of equal signs. And let's wait for a key to be pressed after that. Haha! All right, one feature down. So we've got the journal contents displaying. Let's try clearing the file. So if we flip back and we think about clearing the file, words we might think of are erase and delete to look through here. So I see something called delete, and if I open that up, it tells me it deletes the specified file. We give it a file name, it deletes it. There are a bunch of exceptions that could happen, and there's an example here that shows us how to loop over a bunch of files and delete them. So this might at first glance sound like a good thing for us to do, but what would happen if we deleted the file and then the user went back to try and read the file again? This would probably do something unexpected because the file is gone. It's been removed from the hard drive. So in our application, when we clear the file, we just want an empty string to be inside of this file. We don't want to remove the file. We always need to make sure that we've got that file there so that we can read it and add things to it later. So instead of delete, if we go back, maybe there's a way for us to write to the file that would allow us to clear the contents. So I'll zoom down to the right, and if we go back to the write all text, this should, it says creates a new file, writes to the specified file, and closes the file. If it already exists, it is overwritten. So that means that if we use write all text and we give it an empty string for the contents, it's going to go to where we tell it, and it's going to basically end up clearing the file. So the myjournal.txt will be there, but there will be nothing in it. So this sounds like a better fit than delete for our purposes. So let's fly back here. And let's try file.writeAllText. And we want to use our journal file and pass in an empty string. And then we should probably do some formatting. Let's go with a black console color here and write line journal cleared. And wait for a key to be pressed. So let's go ahead and if we fly back up to run, we'll display the journal contents, we'll clear the file, and then let's display the journal contents again to make sure that our clear worked. There's our test content, journal cleared. Run it again, nothing in the journal. And we can also verify this if we check out myjournal.txt in Visual Studio. Hey, all that stuff is gone. So writeAllText inside of our clear file method was really useful. We're kind of using it in a way that maybe it wasn't intended as its primary purpose of putting a blank text, putting a blank string here, but we did. So we used this to basically clear out that file. You can also use this to just set up a file with a bunch of content in it already, where you would just pass that in here as the second string. Okay, 2/3 of our features are done. We have the journal contents, the clearing, so we just need to be able to let the user actually add things to the journal via our console application. So there are a number of ways that we can do this. I think the easiest thing for us to do to get started is to just say, we're going to read a line, and whatever they type in, we want to put that into the text file. So let's create that code before we figure out how to get that into the text file. We need to get something from the user. So let's, I'm going to set the console color to black, and let's print out a message. What would you like to add? And I'm going to switch the console color back to our magenta color. Or was it, I think it was dark magenta that we were using. Yes, so that the user interface kind of matches, so that the user knows that purple is the journal contents. So now when we get a new line of text from the user, they will be typing in magenta. So we'll print out a little message, and let's make sure that this message is in black, that the journal has been modified, and we'll wait for a key to be pressed. So far, we haven't done anything with this new line that we have read in. So it'll just ask us what we want to add and then tell us the journal's been modified without actually modifying the journal. So we're going to have to look at the docs, but let's make sure that this structure works before we actually add in the file logic. So if I fly back up here, let's get rid of the clear, and let's ask if they want to add an entry and then display the contents after. What would you like to add? This is my first entry. The journal has been modified. So the color here looks like it's working, and our wait for any key is working, but we still need to dump this text into our journal. So let's head back down to the add entry method. I'm just holding control and clicking to take me directly there. And we need to find something that will allow us to not write to the text file and clear it, but add something to that text file. So we might look for something like add in the A section, which we don't see add, but we do see a synonym, append here, or a sort of synonym here. So we've got a couple of different ways that we can append, including one that's append text. This sounds like what we want. Oh, you know what? Actually, now that I'm reading it, this doesn't sound like what we want. This is going to use a stream writer, which we could use, but we would have to do it in this way, where we're going to use a using block to set up a scoped block where we have access to the stream writer. If we fly back, aha, append to all text. So this allows us to open a file, append a string to that file, and then close the file. So we give it a path and we give it a string to add to that path, and it'll go ahead and do that for us. And same deal, it's got a bunch of exceptions that would be good for a more complete software application to handle. And we can see an example of it here, where they're creating a string and they're appending it to the file at this location. So let's do that in our application here. Whoops, not in clear file. What am I doing? We're down here in entry. So here's where we've got our string variable that we want to add to our text file. So file, append all text to our journal file. And here we could just pass in the new line that's been typed in, but this doesn't add an extra new line after it. So it's, if someone types in an entry, it would show up here, and then the next one would just show up right next to it and next to it. So what we kind of want to do is set it up so that after they type something in, it adds a new line afterwards, and then the next thing that they type shows up here, and then the next thing shows up after it. So instead of just putting the direct string that they've typed, let's turn this into an interpolation string where we can say, let's do something like entry on one line, a new line, and we'll display a little greater than sign, and then we insert whatever they've typed. So all of this is just formatting, which should allow us to get something that looks like this. Journal has been modified, and then we get our entry. So it prints out entry, colon, and then a new line, and then the actual entry that we're typing in. And if we run it multiple times, each entry shows up one after another in our journal. And I think maybe I'll add another new line after this so that the entries get spaced out, so it's a little bit more legible here. And of course, you can check out your text file where you can see the changes as well. So I think let's just add a new line at the end, and this should be good. I'm going to clear out the contents, hit play. Prints out our journal contents, and now there's a space before and after. So we've got our basic version of this journal app built, which allows us to use some of the system.io namespace, in particular the file class, to do things like check if a file exists, create the file, write contents to the file, clear contents to the file, clear contents from the file, and add new entries to the file. This is still far away from our final application that I showed you at the beginning, because right now there's no menu that allows the user to navigate through these options. Like maybe they want to add a couple of entries and then check the journal contents, or maybe they want to open it up and clear the journal contents. There's no choice here. So what I'm going to do is we'll stop the video here. We got our basic version working. We now understand the system.io. And in the next part, we'll build the rest of the application.